Welcome to this explainer. We're zeroing in on the exact historical flashpoint where human thought pivoted from mythological poetry to systematic, observable science. We're going to rigorously analyze early Greek thinkers, specifically as their ideas were preserved by Aristoteles, to uncover how they conceptualized a universe governed by unified physical laws rather than the whims of angry gods. It's honestly fascinating to trace exactly how they deduced this without a single modern telescope or microscope at their disposal. Here is our roadmap for the analysis. We'll start with the introduction and thematic thesis, move into the historical and cultural context, and then examine the literary composition and style. From there, we'll break down the ethical and philosophical framework, track the dialectical progression of arguments, and finally wrap up with their transmission and enduring legacy. Section 1. Introduction and Thematic Thesis. Let's dive right into this inaugural attempt by early thinkers to push past myth. They introduce a foundational concept that later sources famously categorized as the arche, meaning the primary foundational material principle of all reality. By isolating hudor, water, as this primordial essence, the text makes a profoundly radical claim. It insists that the cosmos is inherently intelligible. It sets up this framework of material monism, which is really just a precise way of saying that absolutely everything, solid earth, vapor, biological life, fundamentally derives from one single substance. By putting this forward, they were essentially demanding rational deduction over traditional superstition. Section 2. Historical and Cultural Context. To truly grasp this conceptual revolution, we have to situate ourselves in the geopolitical environment of the early Milesian school in Ionia. Because massive intellectual breakthroughs don't just happen in a vacuum, right? Ionia was this booming, cosmopolitan maritime hub. And crucially, unlike the massive palatial empires of the ancient Near East, it operated entirely independently of rigid, centralized religious hierarchies. It was a melting pot that catalyzed a brilliant synthesis. It brought together precise Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian geometric land surveying, and fused them with a uniquely Greek tradition of secular public debate. And when you lay out the timeline, it's wild how fast this evolved. In the early 600s BCE, you have these rapidly expanding maritime trade routes flooding coastal cities with new capital and entirely new perspectives. By the mid-600s, foreign mathematical and empirical tools were supplying the exact technical groundwork needed for secular inquiry. And then, by the late 600s, this mercantile autonomy sparked a profound cultural transformation. Public debate systematically began to supersede unquestioned religious authority. The stage was perfectly set for early natural philosophy to explode. Section 3. Literary Composition and Style. Now, here is the great hermeneutic hurdle we face when analyzing this archaic naturalism. We do not actually possess the original native writings of these early Milesians. Instead, we have to rely entirely on fragments and doxographical testimonies from later thinkers, primarily Aristoteles. The complication here is that Aristoteles retroactively applied his highly structured, mature philosophical vocabulary to their primitive, yet brilliant, observations. So when we read this, we're basically looking at archaic empirical intuition filtered straight through the highly analytical teleological lens of classical Athenian logic. It's kind of like trying to understand early acoustic blues through a modern heavy metal soundboard. Section 4. Ethical and Philosophical Framework. Digging into this internal framework reveals exactly how these early deductions championed observable evidence over traditional theological fatalism. The pivotal logic is embedded right here in this specific testimony from Aristoteles. The nutrient of all things is moist, and the seeds of everything have a moist nature. This establishes an incredibly rational internal logic. It leverages the moist nature of biological nourishment and heat to assert hudor as the universal material cause. What's amazing is that this isn't just abstract guesswork. It's a direct observable biological deduction scaled all the way up to a macrocosmic level. Now, we do need to carefully contextualize the famous ancient maxim attributed to the school, the idea that the totality of existence is full of thei, or gods. You might hear that and think, wait, aren't they supposed to be secularizing nature? But here's the catch. This is absolutely not a reversion to popular religion. It's a radical redefinition. The text essentially rebrands the concept of deities to represent the inherent, self-animating life force present in all matter. They're elevating nature itself to a state of dynamic, kinetic action governed by consistent physical mechanisms. Section 5. Dialectical Progression of Arguments. The progression of the core argument in these testimonies is a masterclass in early logic, moving methodically from static principles to highly dynamic mechanics. First, it establishes the cosmological foundation, the idea that the Earth physically rests upon a primordial oceanic base of Udor, floating like a log. But then, the dialectic rapidly accelerates to step 2, using the lodestone, or the magnet. The magnet's capacity to move iron serves as definitive empirical proof of inherent kinetic motion in ostensibly dead matter. If an inert stone can physically pull iron, matter itself must contain invisible mechanical power. And that brings us directly to the conceptualization of the psyche, or the animating soul. By positing the psyche as the actual generator of kinetic energy, a motive force observable in magnets and amber, the internal logic systematically bridges the massive gap between macrocosmology and microbiology. It explicitly refutes the assumption that raw matter is dead, establishing instead that life and motion are fundamental mechanical properties of the physical universe itself. Section 6. Transmission and Enduring Legacy. Finally, we have to look at the massive enduring legacy of this text. Embedding this early empirical naturalism into later systematic treatises permanently recorded an absolute watershed moment in human history, the paradigm shift from mythos to logos. Mythos represents the older worldview of mythological stories, where lightning is just a weapon hurled by an angry deity. Logos represents this newly codified systematic empiricism, where lightning is rationally deduced as meteorological friction. This text literally documents the exact historical threshold where human thought crossed from one era into the next. By establishing the definitive precedent for material monism, the idea that the staggering complexity of reality can be reduced to simple, observable physical laws, this text forged the conceptual tools required for all subsequent physical science. It provided the intellectual blueprint we still operate on today, which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought. As we look at the most advanced astrophysics and quantum mechanics of our current era, how much of our modern scientific inquiry is still fundamentally, inescapably anchored in these inaugural ancient deductions about water, matter, and motion?